podcasting happened, that just changed everything. It really became possible that you could create your own little world.
The more creative possibility you give yourself within the format, the more room there is to keep trying stuff.
It's so cheap, this medium we work in, and that's sort of where I see so much energy in podcasting, that there's so many people saying, yeah, I'm just gonna try this and see what happens.
And so, like, what we're supposed to talk about today is like how we got our starts, how to get a start in podcasting. And I think like the funny thing is that like none of us have the same answer for any of this. So yeah, like the really basic like level one question, like how did you get your start? Like how did you end up like sitting here? Like, do you guys want to try to answer that?
So mine is in this really weird way. I was trying to get on This American Life for a while, and I wound up sending in, I'd gotten like rejected a lot, and decided that instead of sending like written essays, I would try to send in some audio. And at that time, this was many years ago, it was like 15, 16 years ago, you couldn't just like make stuff on your computer. And so I decided I was going to use my parents' answering machine and record on the on the micro cassette. And then I would like chop the tape up by feeding it into this shiny red boom box. And I wound up sending the tape, I FedExed it to This American Life. I knew that they were working on an apocalypse theme, and I sent them this tape, and I wound up getting a call from Ira Glass the next day on my answering machine saying like, who are you? Give me a call. And I called him. I was in art school at the time, and I called him from the hospital because I was getting a lesson in cadavers. So I like almost passed out from the formaldehyde, and then I went and called him. That's how I got my start.
That's great. Should we just round the circle?
Yeah. So yeah, I come from the public radio background as well, and I remember having a lot of friends in those early days of This American Life, and what was the other one, The Next Big Thing, and there were a couple shows that everyone was trying to get pieces on. But I think for me, early on, I just wanted to have a show. Like I was so bad at pitching pieces like my whole life. I don't even know where to start. And I just think that, yeah, I wanted to have a show. That I could sort of understand how that worked. Like it was my thing, and like I would get to control it. But I knew that, before podcasting, like that just, walking into the station, the manager's office and saying, oh yeah, you should just give me a show. It was like not gonna happen. So once podcasting happened, that just changed everything. It really became possible that you could create your own little world. You could control the whole shebang. And so actually I was working at this center at the Harvard Law School called the Berkman Center in 2004 when actual podcasting started. And I just had put my show, it was on like a college station in Boston, like a community station, and I called it The Theory of Everything. And someone sent me a link to like Gizmodo, how like they had this thing called podcasting. I was like, wait, that's what everyone was talking about. Dave Weiner and Christopher Lighton and Adam Carolla. So I like made it a podcast, and I sort of squeezed in early, and I was there for podcasting bubble number 1. And then, of course, by like 2008, no one cared about it anymore. And then I think we had the second, podcasting 2.0, which I'm part of the Radiotopia Network. I'm one of the co-founders of that, and our ringleader, Roman Mars, which I feel did like the first. There's been a lot of successful Kickstarter podcasts, but he really sort of is the inflection point for me, where I feel like his early Kickstarter sort of connected with the listener-supported content model of public radio plus podcasts, and here we are today.
Yeah, I've been a little bit of everything in media. I started in print, started a website which lasted for about 15 years, went into TV broadcasting, then public radio, and now I teach at NYU and also do my podcast, which I love.
My answer, I guess, is pretty different because I don't come from a radio background. I don't come from a media background. Like the short answer is I bought a microphone and got a Libsyn hosting account and started recording a thing. I was still am, but I was getting my MFA in creative writing and missed like making things, like being in control of what I was making. Because with writing, I was just feeling like I was submitting things and waiting for someone else to publish it. And I missed being able to actually just make a thing and get it out into the world myself, which I know you can do in publishing. But I was listening to podcasts through all of the podcast bubbles, the ups and downs, and then I started making one.
I feel like something that like runs through all of these is like, I don't think any of us feel like we are making stuff that anyone would have necessarily given us like permission to make. Like if you'd ask somebody, they'd be like, there's no audience for that, or I don't understand it, or I don't like it. And the nice thing about podcasting is you don't really need anybody's permission to do it. And like the downside of that is that it's sort of like throwing a party and like hoping somebody shows up, and that can feel like awful. Does anybody like remember a moment early where it felt like, oh, like this is sort of working? Like one of your friends is actually listening all the way through instead of being like, I love that thing in the first 30 seconds of the thing you did and sent me. Or like where it felt like, I don't know, like real.
I pay attention to what people say on Twitter. So the two most flattering things I've heard on Twitter were, one was a woman who said, I listen to you while I code. And I actually think that that's a really interesting liminal space where you have obviously a lot of different ways to pay attention to things, and you can listen to something while you're doing certain types of other tasks. So I liked that. Like she was paying attention, but she was using it as that friend in the room while she coded. And then another guy gave a very specific compliment, which is that, most of the podcasts now that do well are sound-rich podcasts, and mine is not. It's just conversation. And he said, it's just conversation, but wow, the topics, And I was like, there you go.
Yeah.
I think that question is so good because it's even bigger than podcasts. It's almost like making art or making your thing. And I think you have to please yourself kind of first. I mean, or at least that's the audience that almost matters the most, especially since, you're doing this thing that, you don't have permission to do it, but you're like, why are you, you have to at least be making something that you're kind of going to be excited about. But it makes me think of, I was doing this I started making radio stuff like in the middle of the night on a community station, and I remember thinking today, like, oh, I'm so happy that was before digital audio and like all the MP3s were there the next morning. But that's still because that audience, you can imagine who's there, but it's also yourself. Like you have to be doing stuff that you're going to want to listen to first. Otherwise, it's not going to work, I think.
Yeah. But I feel like that's also the weird thing is like you make things that are really for you, and then you find out there's like more yous out there, and they're actually not very much like you, or they are, but like that they find the same stupid jokes funny, or like the same kinds of conversations interesting. That there's like I feel like that's like one of the, and there's like with radio, it always feels like you're talking at, and it's like it's out there, and it's like it's gonna be at 11 o'clock today, and like you're gonna hear it if you like it or not. There's something nice about like the idea that the people who are there like want to be there. I don't know. I also think like it seems like Hillary, you in particular, like the thing you found with your show is there's this like you guys put it out at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Because like that your audience is like up often at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Like I feel like you've done this thing of making a community through it, which is this like word we always say, but it doesn't often mean that much.
No, I know. I hear people talking about, public radio is a community, and I'm never like sure exactly what that means, except for like it's a website where people can leave comments and there's like events and stuff. But like I never intended for this to become a community. I actually started my podcast because I was almost a year into having a baby, and I felt like I was going to disappear. I felt like I didn't know anyone in the town that we moved to. I had become used to, before having a baby, like working, the way that people do in media, like all hours and stuff, and suddenly I had no work. And I just felt like I needed to make something, and I needed to connect with people. And so I started just calling people up and asking them to have real conversations with me about parenthood. And it was really supposed to be just a selfish, cathartic thing for me. And the thing that I found, and I just like emailed a bunch of friends and colleagues and told them like, I made this thing. Listen to it, maybe. And it started spreading around without me. I did not do the thing you're supposed to do with like making your own PR machine. it started spreading around, and people started like engaging with it and saying that it was like making them feel whole. And yeah, so it's sort of like, then, and you asked that earlier question about how you knew it was like, you know, making an impact. And I started hearing people saying that like, people I knew were going to work and like hearing people over the water cooler talking of like, oh, your wife is pregnant, she's got to listen to this. And so that, you know, made me feel like it was doing something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's weird. Like, you can never tell. I feel like one of the other things is like literally, like when I send emails asking people to be on the show, I feel like I can't tell if it's like, I feel like I still struggle with like if it's real or fake. Like, it's like a new word, and like people don't like new words. Like radio, people like radio. People like being on the radio. People like saying like, I gotta leave work for an hour to be on the radio. But like, I gotta leave work for an hour to talk on Skype to somebody for a podcast is like still kind of like a hard sell. Are you guys finding that? Is that like?
I remember when you were telling me that, you know, when you left the radio to do the podcast, that you were worried about that, and I was like, just keep using the word radio. They won't notice. Did you decided not to go with that?
I have like a very dodgy paragraph that like uses the word radio a lot, and like WNYC is definitely in there, and then it's like, but this thing that I'm doing.
Say radio. Just say radio.
Yeah, because it's not working.
One of the people I interviewed said, "What's a podcast?" And I said, "It's radio without the radio," and she seemed to get that.
Yeah, that's good. I've just been saying radio. But I hate the word podcast. I've always hated the word podcast, and I will go to my grave hating the word podcast.
How come? Because there's a product name in it?
I think it's just because I come from that early moment of like 2004 when the elitism of radio was like, oh, you have a podcast. Whereas today you can feel a little better about it. You know, I think especially with, you know, the fact that, you know, these new podcasting operations are happening. There's people at work saying, oh, you have to hear this podcast. It's post-serial, too. I think things have changed a little bit. But I don't know. There's something about that word that has always felt like oh, you're not on the radio.
So it's like a little bit less. It's like silver medal. Yeah, even when it's not anymore.
I don't think it is anymore.
I know, but yeah.
I don't know. As someone who has never worked in radio, and maybe it's just because I've been listening to podcasts for a while, but I think that might be a perception that's inside radio and not outside of it. Because to me, podcasts, in some ways, they're the way that I get to listen to the public radio shows that I'm not like making an appointment to sit and turn on, you know, to sit around the radio with my family listening to whatever shows. But there are also so many shows that so many things that people love that are entirely separate from radio, that aren't just the podcast version of the radio show or the podcast that's put out by the public radio company. They're their own thing.
No, I think that's a great point too. It's you know, even further on that, I think that there's like the statistic that we hear media reporters talking about how many people are listening to radio versus audio on their computers, and they always seem to miss the one that is most important, which is like no one under 30 has a radio.
No. Yeah. It was like a pledge gift.
Yeah, you know, it's like they're listening to all kinds of things.
I was curious with Jamie. So like, I feel like we're like, oh, we just like started this thing, but we had like this advantage of being like, we just started this thing after like being trained in like this world to various extents of like the people who are really good at doing it. Like literally, when you decided you wanted to do this, what did you Google? Like, where did you start?
That's a good question. I remember I was Googling a lot. I did like a lynda.com little course on...
Wait, what's lynda.com?
It's actually a website that sponsors a lot of podcasts that I listen to. I think they've been sponsoring Back to Work lately. I had access to it because I'm still enrolled as a student in my grad program, but it's web tutorials and like web courses for literally everything.
It's pretty amazing.
So I think I looked at one for GarageBand podcasts, but there's like any sort of, they don't sponsor my show, but
they will now.
Yeah,
they will.
I would be better if I had copy in front of me, but I mean, you can learn coding, Photoshop, you know, GarageBand, and Pro Tools, anything basically. But there are also things like there's a course on on getting things done, you know, like the productivity book, and the guy who wrote the book does the course.
Huh.
Is that lynda.com? Am I confusing it with something else? It is? Okay. A lot of podcast ads in my head. But so I looked at that, and I actually spent a lot of time on the podcasting subreddit, just like asking questions, doing searches, reading recommendations for like what microphone, how to do stuff. And then it was just a lot of messing around, like sort of trial and error, learning how to edit audio, how to record, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, how did you know that it was time to just like put the thing out?
I actually, it was a few months, and I wanted to like build up a sort of backlog, because my show is built up of writers reading their work, like you're going to a reading series, but it's in a podcast in your ears. And so I had like a little backlog of those, and I'd started that in the fall a couple of years ago, and so I had to wait for the holidays to be over, and then I had to wait until I had enough of them. And it was more that I was really eager to get it out and wanted to just make sure that everything was in place, but I don't know what everything is. It was like a Tumblr and a Twitter, and that was about it.
Yeah, I know what you mean, though. I mean, I don't know. You have like your checklist in your head, and also like the way you were thinking about it. Like when we were doing this thing institutionally, like it did not occur to us that like people don't listen to stuff over the holidays. Like that didn't. Yeah. Anyway, what's really bad advice that you guys got at some point? Like well-meaning, just dumb stuff.
You have to have a certain number of listeners before you can be taken seriously.
Who said that?
Lots of people. I mean, before you can make this your job. But yeah, it's hard to get those number of listeners if you don't have someone backing you.
Yeah, that's true.
So I actually used the Kickstarter to show that I could bring in the supporting funding if someone were to support me.
I know the advice I got. It was around 2009. Someone said, yeah, this podcast thing is stupid. It's over. You should just like quit.
Really?
Yeah.
Who?
A very like person who's involved in like big media funding, a funding person. Good friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said, oh, this podcasting thing's over. And it was like, then Roman did his thing, you know, like a couple months later.
So satisfying.
Yeah. That was great advice.
People, you guys just have like good friends who don't undermine you by telling you bad advice or like are thoughtful.
Yeah, or maybe I just like.
I haven't gotten any bad advice.
I don't think the only piece of advice I think I've gotten was to make the writers' bios shorter when I read them on the air, and I was like,
That's
the
good
point?
advice.
Yeah, that's the point.
I've gotten a lot of good advice, no bad advice.
What was some good advice?
Well, I mean, you know, I'm sort of between seasons, meaning that we have a few episodes of season 2 left, and then in the fall we'll go into season 3. So there's been a lot of advice I've gotten about thinking about the length of, you know, because these are just conversations, but I like to really include a professional conversation. So I've talked to everyone from Gloria Steinem to venture capitalist, coder, and economist Albert Wenger to Melody Hobson is the one who's up now, who's a financier. And then, you know, Richard Kadri, who's a best-selling, like, sort of goth, occult novelist. So I just talk to people who I think are smart and interesting. And so the question that I'm facing that we talked about a little bit was, you know, can I have that wide of a segment of people on one podcast? And it's not that people have come up with the right answer. I don't know if there is a right answer, but I've been having great dialogues, and some of it may be about the length of the podcast or segmentation into, you know, sort of social audio. Like how do you create the right bite size to intrigue people that's tweetable, that's shareable, that's embeddable. So it's those kind of conversations where I'm getting a lot of great feedback.
And how much are you paying attention to, like, oh, that one really landed, that one people were listening to it? Like, how much are you taking
I'm
them
really
into
paying
account?
attention. I mean, one of the things that I may do is a completely different podcast that I'm working on the idea of called street politics, where I feel like, I mean, I've covered every election since '96. And so I've spent a lot of time around powerful people and looking at politics from a rather top-down and analytical perspective. But I'm really interested in what people consider politics from the ground up. Like if you went to Koreatown in Los Angeles, what would people say? It would be different from going to South Central. It would be different from going to Bel Air. It would be different from going to all these, I used to live in LA. And the same thing with New York. If you're in Greenpoint, it's different from, going to, the Lower East Side, which is different from Brownsville. And so I'm thinking about, because I get to travel a lot, at least for the moment, I'm thinking about doing something different and sort of getting feedback on that. But I don't want this project that I'm working on now to die. I do want to refine it. And I think that, I think the great thing about podcasts is that they're certainly not free, but they're inexpensive enough that you can experiment with form and you can experiment with how you approach things. And I think sound-rich podcasts are very different than interview-only podcasts.
Yeah, we have a lot of conversations where the end of it ends up being like, well, it's free to try it. Like I feel like since I got from like the world of pure radio to the world of like pure podcasting and like a stop in between, like we try more bad ideas, and some of those bad ideas end up being like, some of them end up being very bad ideas, and some of them end up being like good ideas in disguise. And it's just like the fact that you can both try it in the production process, you can try and like putting it out and like seeing if people respond to it. I don't know. I think, yeah.
That's such I love that you said that that's the journey from point A to point B, but I mean, the thing about audio, the medium that we're working, it's so cheap. The medium that we're working with, to say no, I worked at, a similar institution, maybe the same one, and there was a lot of being told no, like you can't try this. And like that really frustrated me a lot because again, it's so cheap, this medium we work in. And that's sort of where I see so much energy in podcasting, that there's so many people saying, yeah, I'm just going to try this and see what happens. And I think that's really important to go with that because, yeah, you're really not invested. It's not like you're making a movie where you've got like, naked extras running down the street that you have to have the camera shot. It's just a microphone, recorder. It's totally worth trying to see if it can happen.
It also feels like for whatever reason, the people listening are really forgiving of like, you try something, it doesn't work. Yeah, maybe they turn that one off and like they come back next week. Like it feels like it's hard to like, you can try, but it's like hard to like completely alienate the people who have shown up. I don't know.
Oh, let me get back to something. I drifted off on my own little flight of fancy, but one thing you said about metrics, like one of the most, I think probably the most shared thing we've done was not anyone who has a public profile. It's this woman who's the oldest full-time National Parks Ranger in America. She's 94 years old now.
How'd you find her?
She had actually been done in a couple of other formats in print, and NPR did her. But I was like, look, NPR is going to do maximum 8 minutes, and I can do half an hour to 45. And she's just one of these people, like I later met her in person, and she's like, I'm too busy to die. And I was like, you're my adoptive grandmother now, And it's like, I mean, it's like, I think people related to this idea of that living a great life doesn't mean being rich or famous. It means being vigilant and passionate. And that's exactly what she was. And she also just said things that were really funny to me. Like I said, so what's your secret, to staying healthy? She's like, it's all genes. My great grandmother was a slave and she lived to 100 and so, and like she listed all these really, basically everyone died over 100, and she was like, it's just genes. And I was like, okay, moving right along. But it was a great answer, I thought,
Did you know interviewing her? Were you like, this is gold, this is gonna work, this is gonna be good?
I just thought that it was a brilliant concept, but she was even more brilliant than the concept in reality.
Yeah. Yeah, that feeling, I don't know, good talkers.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a million more questions written down. It's very important that I consult it. What do you find yourself doing differently because it's a podcast? I feel like we kind of answered that.
I'm curious actually, it doesn't have to be versus like radio versus writing. Like what's the thing that you, in the course of doing it, you've realized like, works because of the medium, like a kind of conversation you can have, the amount of time you can spend with somebody. Like, what do the strengths of it feel like to you guys as people making them?
So something I've found with the podcast is that I can confront people. Like, I'm not a confrontational person, but in my show, I felt betrayed by this woman who's the leader of the natural childbirth movement in this country. Her name's Ina May Gaskin. And I felt like she was setting up this thing where people who wanted to have an intervention-free childbirth and didn't get it were failures. And a lot of people feel this way, that if you don't, it's like something to achieve. If you don't achieve it, then you're a failure, and it leads to a lot of postpartum depression and I've heard a lot of like midwives and doulas sort of in her name say like, you're failed by the hospital if you don't get to achieve this, and then there's this other thing called the golden hour, that like if you don't spend the first hour that your baby is born with the baby like suckling on you, then like your relationship will suffer for the rest of their life or your life with them.
No
and
pressure.
yeah, and so I didn't get to have that. I didn't get to have either one of those things, and I felt really mad at her. And so I thought about like, I'm gonna interview some like other midwife and like, have a conversation with them. And then I was like, wait a minute, I could actually go to her. Would she come on my podcast? This is a thing where I was like, it's not the radio. But maybe it makes it safer that it's a podcast. I don't know. So she came on, and I kind of like nervously told her why I was mad at her. And she was like, you're making me consider rewriting my book. And it was not an outcome I went in wanting or expecting, and she's currently rewriting her book, and all because of that conversation and subsequent like blog comments. And it's like, if this really like gets published and happens, it's gonna like have a pretty big impact in the childbirth world. And so now I'm starting to get like sort of more courageous and think about like, well, what else could we do? I don't know. Like I never thought about that. I was never like a political reporter or anything. So I don't. But it's like sort of stemming from, again, this like sort of selfishly motivated thing. Like I have these questions and I want to understand what people's motivations are, or like know if there are other people like me. And I feel like podcasts offer that kind of intimate, way of doing this. And if I was on some like general, radio show, I wouldn't be able to sort of keep hammering away at keep digging at this sort of topic over and over again in different ways.
Well, and in that episode, so it started out, and you said I was on this call-in radio show, and we sort of had a conversation about this, but I feel like the point I was trying to make didn't get out, and you played tape from it, and that was something that, listening to your interview with her, I feel like part of what made it work, even as a confrontation, was that you sounded like you in it. You sounded, I don't know, there's something, did you think about, this is such an inarticulate question. When you were describing it, you said nervously confronting her. And I feel like while you were talking to her in that conversation, I could feel how you felt about everything you were saying in a way that if it had been in print, I wouldn't have felt. And if it had just been in a more typical, if it had been a newscast and you had to be a stentorian reporter, did you think about, do you think about how those things play into conversations like that? The cliche would be intimacy of whatever, but do you know what I mean?
I mean, in the moment, I was like, I'm sounding nervous. Am I supposed, should I sound like I'm really confronting her? But is she gonna walk out? I don't know. I was so in the moment. I wasn't thinking about how is this gonna play?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a question asked by a robot. How did you prepare for it?
I just thought about I reread her books, and I just really thought about well, what do I want to know, and what do I think other people might want to know? What would be satisfying to get out of this conversation? Because I know there's other people who would want to ask these questions, and what would we collectively want to know from her?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that one, I mean, you saw that feels like a similar thing where it's you can tell by something about the quality of the conversation or by the level of your interest that this is going to be a thing that people are going to respond to. Maybe not to the extent that people did respond to it, but you knew in the making that's an important one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's not a question, it's just a statement. What about you guys? Is there anything that you find yourself doing that feels like you're doing it because it's a podcast?
Going long. I mean, I go really long. When I talk to Albert Wenger, who He's one of the principals in Union Square Ventures. And, you know, I'd already booked him, but I read this really interesting post that he did about basically missionless people finding their mission in things like terrorism. It was after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And he's just such a broad thinker. He covers he's got this great blog, continuations.com, and he talks about computer science, economics, the future of work, venture capital, investing, on and on and on. And so we started out talking about terrorism and what happens to people when they're underemployed in societies. And that's just one of the things that happens, not the only thing. And we talked about the future of the economy, you know, whether or not we should have a guaranteed basic wage, all of these things. Like, you know, I like the fact that podcasts allow me to go long. And it's not like, what are you investing in? Because that's actually not really what I talked to him about. We talked very little about investing. It wasn't that I didn't care about his investments, and we did talk about it, but I was more interested in how he is as a global thinker. And I'm really often frustrated by soundbite media, you know? So not everyone has the fortitude to listen to everything that I tape, but I prefer to have more. I think what's critical for me at this point is to think about not necessarily how to make everything shorter, but how to segment material that we do, like in a multi-topic conversation so that people can find pointers to what they're most interested in. But I like the flexibility of being able to go long.
How much do you decide like where stuff's going to go before you go into the conversation? Like,
I just read obsessively and research obsessively, and I take a few notes, and then I wing it based on what I'm interested in.
Do you feel like the people you talk to are surprised at like how much you want to talk about, or how much that it's not narrow?
No, because, I mean, I pick people who are broad thinkers, and I would say out of the 2 seasons, I've known about 2/3 of the people in some context. But then the people that I don't know, like the National Parks Ranger, Betty, she, you know, just reading, she has an incredible blog on her own because she's the matriarch of her family at this point, and she keeps the family history, and she's like, I blog for my family, and of course now she's gotten all these other friends and, you know, fans from reading her blog, but I was like, she's talking about, you know, the documentation of race relations in Northern California in the 1950s and the post-war era, and she's talking about starting a record store after her husband, who was like this star athlete and academic, was put into dishwashing in the military, and they were like, we'll never work for a white person again. And like all these conversations about her life that are threaded into her blog, I was like, well, we can just go there, you know? So I didn't know her, but I read through her life as she documented it, and then I was able to ask her a lot of things that I don't think a lot of other people have asked her about.
But you picked, I mean, when you say you didn't know her, like I could feel, I mean, there was still that it was your choice. Like you wanted, you could hear it, you wanted to talk to this person.
Most of the people I've interviewed are people who I've either interviewed before or who I know from some professional context. And that also makes them less guarded. Like when I talked to Melody Hobson, who's married to George Lucas, I was like, you know, have you, you know, I said something like, did you like Star Wars when you were a kid? And she said, absolutely.
Did you like the new ones, though?
No, I didn't ask her that. I didn't go there. And she said, absolutely. Or she said something, and my response was, that's a political answer. And then she was like, no, it's the first movie I ever watched in a movie theater, which is like, if I hadn't provoked, like her original answer was super boring, and she's probably talked about it, you know, in other contexts. But I was like, oh, that's the first movie you ever watched in a movie theater. That, to me, is the more interesting conversation. And it's feeling that you have permission to, you know, these interviews aren't combative, but like if I get a boring answer or if I get an answer that I don't really get where someone's coming from, feel like I have complete permission to follow up.
How do you learn that?
Well, I've been chewed out by a lot of people I've interviewed over the years because I've interviewed all these politicians and celebrities and stuff. And at this point, my level of don't give a fuckitude is pretty high, you know?
Yeah.
And plus, it's a podcast, you can cut out the part where they yell at you.
That's like the best part sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. All right, let me see what else I've got on this.
Have you ever done that?
What?
cut out where they yell at you?
Oh, definitely.
Oh, I did that
Oh,
once
yeah.
with then candidate Obama. He yelled
He
at
yelled
me
at
for
you?
3 minutes.
Whoa, wait, what?
I'd asked him about.
You could have thrown the election.
Probably not. But no, I mean, I had asked him a question about, basically growing up in Indonesia and going to a Muslim school, and he was like, well, that's just what Fox News said. And I said, well, then just say that's what Fox News said. And he's like, no, I want you to rephrase the question. We went back and forth for 3 minutes. And in the end, we had a very limited window because we had to get Clinton, Edwards, and Obama on, so we made a tactical decision not to like keep him from seeming like he wasn't upset, but we were like, do we put him on being upset or do we put on his substantive answers? And it was a hard call because I was kind of like, but he's a politician. I mean, why shouldn't he act like a politician?
Do you wish you'd gone the other way? Do you wish you played the...
No, I don't, because it's not that I feel like we cut him a break. I mean, I actually don't think, I sort of thought he should have answered the question, but I also think that in the end, the point was, this was the last primary before Edwards dropped out, and it was clearly like one of these marquee primaries where people were making decisions between 3 candidates, and then it shrunk to 2, and I think we made the right decisions. But I also kind of was like, well, I wish he'd just answered the question to begin with, but...
Yeah. What was the one that you cut out of somebody yelling at you?
Oh, man. It was I think it was a scientist. It was a few years ago. It's actually when I was doing the Too Much Information show when I was on FM. It wasn't live. It was something I had pre-recorded. But they just really wanted to talk about their book. Yeah, it was another one. Again, like some of the times you get, the easiest way to get someone to be on your podcast or radio show is to get them when they're on their publicity tour, because they're kind of contractually obligated to do this sort of thing. And like all shows, it's a dance. You don't want to be the other person like, and here they are talking about their book again. Here they are flogging their movie. But I usually find a right balance. But this particular guy, he kept. A lot of shows try to they get mad if the guest says the book, please stop saying the book. A lot of shows are like that. Like I'm even letting them do that. But this guy just did not want to talk about anything else except the book, and I
Did he repeat the title 10 times?
Yeah. He's his media training was starting to shine through, and I was just kind of like, and I should have, the smart recorder would have been like, just and cut it out later. But I was like, can you just stop talking? And it just got really ugly.
And you didn't respond well to that?
No, he really didn't like that.
Yeah. How much time have we got?
10 minutes here.
Okay. I just want to make sure there's I want extra question time. What do you guys think is, where do you guys see this going? I feel like, for me, it's weird. This is the first time that I've, I don't know, not had to explain what I do with 3 or 4 sentences after it. It's yeah, I do a podcast, and they're like, yeah, I've heard of Serial, and it's fine. That's the end of the conversation. Do you guys think about what's gonna happen in a year or what's gonna happen in 2 years? Is that boring and businessy? I don't know.
I'm going to be doing this in 2 years.
Right. It's you're going to be making the show.
I see this going for a while. I don't know.
But maybe that's part of what's different, is that there's certainty to it. That it's not this house of cards is going to fall down. Yeah. What about you guys?
The thing that I'm most interested in that I think podcasts need and that I've heard other people talking about is it's not exactly the lack of a platform or the lack of good, podcasting apps for your phone, but the only way that I really hear about podcasts is by word of mouth.
Yeah.
That someone mentions it a few times and I'm like, oh, okay, let me take out my phone and search it. And there's the iTunes charts, and there's, if you use Overcast for your app, there's here's 5 starter packages of podcasts. But the sort of sharing and recommending, but also discovery of new podcasts is challenging, because I know about the podcasts that all my friends listen to, and my friends and I all now listen to the same podcast, and that's really fun. 8 years ago, podcasts were none of my friends, I would listen to podcasts, and then now all my friends do, and that's nice, but there's the sort of, you were saying, intimacy is such a cliche. I mean, I love that all these voices live inside my head and I spend time with them every week or every other week. But podcasts are also a very solitary thing unless you're like riding in the car with someone. So both like the listening, but more just the sharing and the discovery. I think there's a real like lack. There's like a hole that needs to be filled.
And what do you do about just like getting the word out about your show? Like, what do you do?
It's hard. It's like you were saying, yours just sort of snowballed, and that hasn't been the process for me. I think just because like yours fills this like deep human need for recognition and like sharing, whereas mine is like a piece of entertainment.
I think everybody feels that way about their thing. I think only a jerk is like, mine is the necessary thing and everything else is mere entertainment.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing I like still haven't totally cracked. And what I've discovered is that word of mouth is what matters. Like, it doesn't matter, God, like Facebook and Twitter analytics are so alarmingly revealing. It doesn't matter how many people like a Facebook post or retweet a tweet, no one clicks on the links.
Yeah, those are bots.
Yeah. Or it's just people who are like supporting the fact that you do it but are already listening to it. At least for me and my audience right now, because it's like, you know, a few circles of friends and it hasn't like busted out into a million strangers yet. But it's like I don't know that I've ever listened to a podcast because someone shared it on Twitter. I listen because someone tells me, oh, I've started listening to this thing. I think you'd like it. Or someone says, oh, do you listen to this show? I'm like, no, what is it? And then or if it's mentioned on another podcast, I can trace almost every podcast I listen to back to one episode of This American Life. Yeah. Where Luke Burbank it was 8 years ago, he did a story about a guy who liked to dress up like Superman. And then I, months later, started listening to his show. And then Jesse Thorne was on that. And I started listening to Jordan Jesse Go. And then all the Maximum Fun podcasts. And then, like, weird overlap. And then by then, like, the world knew about podcasts. But so it was like word of mouth within podcasts even.
Yeah. We totally designed Radiotopia to do that, you know, with the shows. But I mean, I think, like Hillary, I'm going to do the show, hopefully, in 2 years. But, you know, today on Kickstarter, they had a watch that's made like $7 million. And I'm just curious, since we've got some people, if I stopped making my show and I made the pod watch, would anyone donate to that? Can I see? All right, I'm gonna stick with the
percentage shot.
I'm totally sticking with the podcast.
You swore you were going to do it.
I procrastinated all day. That's all I thought about was making the pod watch.
What about you, Fry? Like, what do you see in?
Well, there's a couple things. There's some things that I think are opportunities. Like, I think that micro media to make audio more shareable. I think that if there was something, and, you know, if there was a platform that was the Vine of audio, it's not that you can't do it technically, it's that people don't share audio in the same ways that they share video. But I think that someone's going to develop the right system for rewarding. It's not so much about creating a system for sharing micro audio, it's about rewarding people who choose the right clips that summarize like a moment in a discourse. And I think that's going to happen probably within the next 2 years. And then I do think, like, I'm not against entertainment at all. The podcast I listen to the most religiously are all science fiction podcasts. They have nothing to do with the news. They have nothing to do. Clark's World. I think it's got the most consistent narration as well as great stories, and they're doing a whole series of writers from China in translation. It's done really well. I love it. But I think that there has to be, I mean, we're heading into an election year. It's early 2015, it's freezing, but basically the election is off and running. And I want to see what news products, you know, it's a horrible way of putting it. It sounds so unappealing, but I want to see what people can do with the concept of news within this idea of the intimate conversations and the sound-rich format of podcast, because I do think that there's some potential there.
That's the future. Do you want to do questions?
Let's do it.
All right. Step right up. Yeah, so I think I was told if you have a question, just go to the microphone on the right-hand side. Are people who are like watching from another room, can they also ask questions or no?
Doors are opening.
Doors are opening. Yeah.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Oh, it is on. PJ, your podcast talks about this the most, but I'm curious from everyone, what goes wrong that makes it so difficult? Like on
Everything.
Hi, better? On Reply All is always like, we got this in just under the gun, or like all these catastrophes happen. But I'm like, I've worked with really small indie podcasts. I know what goes wrong for us. Like, I'm just curious, what goes wrong that makes it so that you're going home at 3 a.m. as opposed to 8 p.m.?
That's a good question. I mean, for us, like, we're still solving it, but it's like, it's trying to figure out if you can do whatever you want, figuring out like what you want your editorial process to be, and like how many edits is enough edits, and when should you like put it to bed, and like when should an engineer grab it. Like I think it's different for everybody, but for us, like we're trying to like recreate an infrastructure we sort of remember. And also, I think the fact that I'm involved like makes it go wrong, because I'm like very disorganized and like very ADD. Are you guys like constantly screwing your things up, or is it working?
Procrastination. Like I didn't do anything today, and all I did was think about making the pod watch. It was total embarrassment. I lost the whole day.
I mean, I'm always like right down to the deadline, and it's just because there's so much to do. I mean, and then let's say you thought someone was gonna be a great talker, and we have a lot of things where like someone will write us a pitch and it's amazing, and then they're kind of like yes and no answerers, and then you gotta find somebody else. I don't know. I think also we have like, I don't know if you guys have this, but like we have a lot. It's not just making radio anymore. I feel so old school saying this, but like when I worked in radio, it used to be just making the radio stories, and I remember kind of like grumbling when we had to take pictures too for websites, and now it's like we have to do the social media, and like we have a 2-person team, and we're doing all of everything on our own now. Like I said, I wasn't my own PR machine then, but I'd have to be now, and like we run these Facebook groups and make events and stuff, and so it's not in the podcast almost sometimes is like an afterthought, and it gets like squeezed in under deadline.
For me, because the format of my show is the same every week, the only time, and it's mostly stitching together things that other people have read from work that's already been written, it's mostly just when like I get in a fight with my own brain trying to record my intro. But I think it's like the more creative possibility you give yourself within the format, the more room there is to keep trying stuff. Yes. And then you never know when it's done. Yes. Like for me, I need to like record my intro and edit things together. For you, you're like inventing a new form for every episode. And I think that where it's like it's like with a piece of writing, how do you know when it's done? I don't know, I could try a whole new structure for it. It's like the more creativity you allow yourself, the harder it is to figure out what you're trying to even do.
Yes. Yeah. We have a graph in the office of like, at what point in the working on it, it starts to get worse. And like, we're trying to figure it out. Because it definitely happens. Like, there's definitely a point where you're just like, you're just messing with it.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Michelle Talbert. I host Her Power Hustle. And the reason I'm saying that is because my question is about marketing and education. You know, you've touched on it a little bit, but I think that there's a piece where I feel I'm trying to educate people about podcasts. Obviously, Serial, Reply All, This American Life have helped, but there's still a lot of education and then marketing when people don't know you exist. And I've been in and out on podcasting since 2009. So it's really just trying to figure out the marketing piece of it when you know you have good content. If you do say so yourself.
What's the name of your show again?
Her Power Hustle. It's for women entrepreneurs.
What's a good episode to start with?
A good episode of my show to start with is with Caroline Clark, who's the host of Black Enterprises Women of Power Television. Yeah. I mean, episode 1.
Episode 1?
Episode 1.
Nice.
I think the best thing you can do is get somebody on who has their own following, and I don't mean they have to be a celebrity. They just have to have their own like social media following. And we always see the biggest jump in our numbers when we do that.
I also think it's much easier to get someone who listens to podcasts already to listen to yours than to get someone who's, for example, an entrepreneur, like your target perfect audience to start listening to podcasts, I think is a lot harder. And that's something that I've struggled with. I'm like, you guys love books, come listen to my podcast. But like, if they're not already spending 40 minutes a day with their headphones in listening to people talking. And so I think like cross promotion on other podcasts, whether it's interviewing a podcast host, being a guest on their podcast, or placing an ad, I think that my guess is that that's the most productive way to find people.
And I also think that you can do live events. I mean, we haven't done any yet for One with Farai, but the Schomburg and I are talking about doing one together. And I think, many people have done live events. So like one of the formats we're considering that you might want to consider is like basically you create an event where you have 3 or 4 people back to back, and then you segment that into 3 or 4 podcasts. You can charge admission, you can get a sponsor, you can do that however you want. There are many ways to do it and not lose money on the process of making your product, and then get people who want to reach a physical face-to-face audience. So that's one thing to think about.
Yeah, I'm shorter. Actually, it just kind of answered my question, but I'm just interested to hear your thoughts anyway. I thought it was really cool how you guys had all these crazy stories about how you started podcasting, and it made me feel really blessed because I work for a book publisher and I started my podcast there. It's called Beaks and Geeks. So we interview authors and it's really great. So I get to get all these amazing authors that they have all this interesting content and it can go so many places. Like, there'll be an author that is a sci-fi author that will get 4,000 views on a podcast, but then we'll have an author who is talking about fashion that could be a really big podcast but only has 78 views. And I just don't understand how we could, we're already a huge publisher, so you would think that we thought it would come easy for us. It's been almost a year now that we would be able to get the views and get the hits and get subscribers, but we don't. And we have it on SoundCloud, and we only have like 80 subscribers. And we're like the biggest publisher. It doesn't make any sense to me how I'm trying to promote it, and I'm not sure how, basically.
Audio's slow burn. It's
Yeah.
slow. It is. I think it's the one thing that makes me feel like, oh, I'll get to do this for a while, because all of this podcast gold rush is like everyone who thinks, oh, we should have 1 million subscribers by 1 year. No, it takes time. It just takes time. Like this, like forging that intimate connection, just you'll get there. Like, as long as you're growing, you're doing something right.
But I also think that connection is an important part of it. And so I guess what I'm curious about then is like, who is the host? And so you have a sci-fi author one week, a fashion writer the next week. What's the constant? Because like the podcasts I listen to, it's like the host is just as important as the guests or as the variation each week. Mm-hmm. And so I think,
yeah, if it's the "What are we publishing this week" show, that might
yeah.
not work.
What's funny is when you were talking about how it's really easy to get a guest when there's an actual book tour going on and you don't want to talk about the books. It's funny because we try not to talk about the books too. We're a book publisher. Yeah. So basically what our little tagline is, we're trying to find who the human is behind, or the geek is behind the book, both personally and professionally. So we do try to drag out that fine line between like, well, we want to promote the book, but we also want to find out something interesting, which we a lot of the times do, which is why I'm trying to promote it, but it's tough.
The other thing, this is like more like cynical pale advice, but I think in these terms, you can just you can be really explicit in asking the people you're interviewing to promote it. And like, you can be like, hey, would you mind tweeting this out, or Facebook posting it, or wherever like your followers are? Can you do it at like 11 o'clock in the morning on Monday? Here's like some language I wrote for you if you feel like using this language. Like people are pretty happy to do it, and I think it helps to be like unshy and like craven in your asks.
Write it for them. And write it for them.
And write it for them. Really write it for them. Like a lot of like people spontaneously liking things on the internet is just like quiet horse trading, and that's fine. Like you can ask, and you can even ask people who like. You can ask people and give them the opportunity to say no if they're going to say no. But like, I find it surprising how cool people are about helping in that way.
Hey guys. Mine's maybe answered also, a variation of the last two, but then this is called Getting Started in Podcasting. So I just saw an article shared that I think the headline was like, kindly, please do not start a podcast. Yeah. And, you know, especially with a hit called Serial, there's going to be a lot, and maybe not all of them are going to be very good. Maybe some of the new podcasts are going to be very bad. And imagining starting off in a world where there's just that much more noise, how do you make yourself stand out? I think I already have my glib answer, which is just don't be bad.
With all due respect, like, fuck them. Like, yeah, there's like a lot of podcasts. Like, there's a lot of books. Like, we can have another one. And like, don't like wait to be good to do this. Like, you need to suck, and you need to suck in public, and it's humbling. And like, you tell yourself it's not bad, but you know it's kind of bad. But like, just I don't know. Like it takes a long time. Like, you put like your flag out and nobody shows up, and you feel like religious and stupid because you're making the thing and nobody's showing up. And then like at some point people do. And they like listen through the back ones, and that's so fuck that guy. Make the thing, yeah.
And just make sure you want to hear it. It's like because if you're the only one there and you hate it, then yeah,
Well,
big trouble.
The rest of what I was getting at is, do you just like startup style? Do you just throw something out there and keep working on it, or do you think there's a value in, you know, polishing, having like 6 episodes in the tank before you release the first one, getting really good visuals before, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I personally think that it's, you know, you should have several in the can, not based on whether or not they're perfect, but just based on, like, I think people like to listen in batches and they want to know that there's a rollout. But I wouldn't wait for perfection, because perfection is never going to happen. But pick people who are your best harsh critics, people who love you but with no mercy, and ask them to listen, and then be prepared to have your feelings hurt and go lick your wounds and then re-edit it.
Yeah, I think it's a balance between not waiting to be perfect, but also like not being sloppy. Like, don't put the art, the like album art, what the podcast art out there before you think it's good. But you know, just yeah, make something you'd be excited to hear.
I also think it depends on, like, are you going for, you want this to be your job, or you want to just make something because you want to make something? Because when I was making this just to make it, oh, it is the first, okay. But so if anyone's just wanting to make something, then, you know, I just was throwing crap out there. You know, like I, you know, recorded in my bedroom, like sitting on my bed, and just would like, I didn't script anything. I would just say stuff, and then I would say it again, say it all these different ways, and then I'd cut it together, and if I thought something was missing, I'd go back, say a couple more things, and then I would put it out there. And I didn't do the thing you're supposed to do where you schedule when it comes out, and we do now because it's a professional podcast. But I think if you want to, you can experiment, and you can just be like, I'm going to do this when I want to do it because that's the only way I'm going to ever get it out. Then I think that's a fine way to start and make it your calling card.
Yeah, but you also talked about how important that was to you, like after you had the kid, and you just had to get back to making stuff. Like I feel like that you can't cut that out of just experimenting. Like there was a real passion that I think you could hear in those early shows. I mean, so I don't think you can experiment, but like I think of like just like the startup model. Like I hear people like, I heard this 4 times now. People are like, oh, I'll just make a podcast about the podcast I'm going to make. I'm like, no, that's terrible. Alex wanted to make a podcast business. He had a very vague, I mean, he had a vague idea that the business might work, but it was an idea. And like, I'm going to make a podcast about the podcast I'm going to make. I don't recommend anyone do that.
Hi, so I have a question that's related to what PJ was asking before about the future of podcasts, but this relates more specifically to how podcasts are funded. I mean, you sort of imagine that at some point, you know, Squarespace and Stamps.com will have, you know, funded every podcast in the universe. But then you think about, you know, the listener-supported networks. I mean, I was thinking about, you know, Max Fun. They're soon going to start up on their annual pledge drive. And I've looked, you know, I've been listening to their shows for years, and it just seems like every year they add another 5 shows. And I mean, is that the key? I mean, similar to Radiotopia, where you see every year, it's like, hey, we want to get like 10,000 subscribers, 10,000 Kickstarter people, or we want to get 5,000 new subscribers to reach our goal for this year. I mean, is this the idea that you just keep expanding into infinitum, or
it's like the Big Bang?
Yeah, sure. What is that? Is that sustainable? I mean, what is that future for funding podcasts?
Nobody knows. I mean, everyone's trying different things, and I was just talking about this with somebody I work with. Everybody who does this, all the leaders, who do this, everyone's getting some things right and some things wrong, and we're all like figuring it out together. Nobody knows.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there will be some interesting models that develop, and people will kind of move into camps. I think that in some ways, I think that what we're calling podcasting will eventually come to include very corporate brands producing branded content, platforms hosting. Like I could definitely see Facebook hosting a podcast channel. I could see, a podcast version of YouTube. I mean, I could see a lot of things that involve platform development that will take podcasting in different directions, and then people will have to make choices about what they do, who their sponsors are. I mean, you already do, but I think that'll become the sort of pros and cons of more money flowing into the space will become apparent.
There's so much money though right now from advertising. It's off the hook. I mean, you say like stamps.com might run out of podcast. No, it's like the amount of advertising focus on podcasting is why I think we have so much excitement. But I feel like what we did with Radiotopia is, and I mean, I think what's more exciting is tapping into the listener-supported model, which goes back to our public radio roots. Like that's so exciting, and like that is. I mean, I just hope we see more of that, because the advertising money, it's just there's trucks of money just like pulling up to these podcast operations, and it really scares me. I mean, I met this young woman who just quit her job at a podcasting. It's not important which one it was. I'm not going to say, but it's really not. I mean, she quit her job because she didn't want to make ads, and I think that like we're at this moment where everyone is trying to figure this out with what is possible with the underwriting, the native advertising. I'm like more excited by the options of like, with Kickstarter connecting to like just our listeners, like wanting to support. I mean, that to me, I find really exciting.
And I also think as a listener who's heard many, many years of Max Fund drives and things like that, I mean, thinking about the listener point of view, I feel much better as a listener knowing that there are lots of people supporting this thing that I love, and knowing that I can become one of them for $3 a month or whatever, and I get my little sticker package, got my tote bag. I love tote bags. Everyone mocks them, but like I can never have enough branded tote bags. But
come to my house and pick up more.
I don't think I'm allowed to. I think it's a one in, one out rule. But like I find myself caring more about the podcasts I listen to than like the people behind them, than the people behind the TV shows or even the books. And so I think that listener, it feels good to pay for the stuff you love. And I think tapping into that can be really powerful and can be, I see like the Kickstarter people being like, yeah. But it's true, like help, like, I don't know, I think that we're at this crossroads in all sorts of media in terms of not like going to the store and buying it anymore. So do we get ads, or do we do subscription models or supported networks? And yeah, the growing networks, it gets unwieldy, but I think there are lots of directions that it can go, and I think that they're going to further differentiate probably. There will be the podcasts that are getting ads and sponsorships, and then there are the podcasts that are supported by like a really rabid, passionate group of people. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm saying they're going to become more and more different, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Can we get one more round of applause for PJ, Hillary, Benjamin, Farai?